So I was working on an entirely unrelated project the other day, and I got to thinking about Space Marine Scouts, a unit that was almost entirely ubiquitous on 8th edition tables and now is basically extinct. I thought it would be an interesting experiment to go through the datasheet, find some uses for this elusive unit, and theorize what might be required to get them back on tabletops in 9th edition. Let's do it! What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're going to be doing another datasheet deep dive. This is the video series where we take a datasheet in Warhammer 40,000 and examine it in excruciating detail. If you enjoy this style of video and the datasheet deep dive series, please drop a like on the video, drop a subscribe down below. Helps let me know that you like this kind of video, and you get to see more videos that I make, so that's pretty cool. Now, this datasheet deep dive is going to be a little bit different than ones we normally do. Today, what we're going to do is go through the Scout datasheet as well as some other variants of Scouts, or in particular, one other variant of Scouts. We're going to talk about the unit attributes of the Scout Squad, what it does on the table, what it's good at. We're also going to talk about how to use it in the situations in which it's actually good, before rendering a final verdict whether you should take Scouts in your list, and talk a little bit about some changes that I would like to see made to the datasheet to help it see a little bit more play. So first off, let's talk about the Scout Squad datasheet. Now, Scouts are the unpower-armored little brothers of Space Marines. They're an elite's choice for a Space Marine army. They come in at a whopping 14 points per model, which is relatively high, but their base stats are pretty good, especially for what is essentially kind of a skirmishing utility unit. They have that Space Marine strength and toughness of 4, 3+ weapon skill, and ballistic skill, but only 1 wound and only a 4+ save. So clearly, we're seeing the downside of not having that power armor on. Losing the 3-up save, losing the extra wound is a really big deal, and does mean that these guys occasionally get shredded by decent anti-infantry firepower that would bounce off a regular power-armored Space Marine infantry. They come in squads of between 5 and 10 and can equip a whole variety of weapons, from shotguns, bolt pistols, and close combat weapons, standard bolters, sniper rifles, a variety of special weapons as well. The Sergeant can equip a combi weapon or a special melee weapon, which is pretty nice to increase the damage output of the unit. You can give them camo cloaks, and situationally, you can give them some additional upgrades. Space Wolves, in particular, can take a variety of power weapons on their standard Scouts, not just the Sergeant, but another model in the unit can also have one of those power weapons as well. And Space Wolf Scouts can also take a special weapon, meaning like a flamer, melta-gun, plasma gun. In addition, you can also take a heavy weapon, either a heavy bolter or a missile launcher, which is fine. Now, the downside of all of these upgrades is that, like we said, the unit is relatively flimsy, only a 4+ save, only 1 wound, and adding additional cost on top of them means that you're gonna pretty often lose that additional investment because they just get killed by something random, which is too bad. Fortunately, we do have baked in a couple of really interesting rules and keywords with these guys. First off, they have all of the normal Space Marine rules. Angels of Death, which also gives them access to Shock Assault, Bolter Discipline, all of those important rules that we need. They can Combat Squad if you're taking a unit of 10, and they have 2 deployment abilities, which are super important. The first one being Concealed Positions, which allows you to deploy them out in front of your army 9 inches away from enemy models or the enemy deployment zone. This is the same rule that a lot of the Phobos troops have, like in Cursors or Infiltrators, and means you can set them up in a similar position. They also have the Outflank rule, which is new in 9th edition and is so incredibly powerful. It lets you essentially use an encirclement or Space Wolf outflank, but for free. In your Declare Reinforcement step, you can just choose to put them in reserve, and instead of coming in and using normal strategic reserve rules or deep strike, they just walk in off of a table edge anytime up to the 3rd battle round if you're playing like a normal GT 2020 game. This is a pretty big deal, and one of the primary uses for Scouts in the Space Marine Codex. They also have a bunch of really important keywords. They have the core keyword, meaning being core infantry, they're going to be affected by almost everything in the faction. All of your auras, all of your rites of wars and litany and things like that are going to impact these guys. You can also use important stratagems on them, like Crucible of Battle out of Salamanders. That is core restricted. All of those things are going to work with Scouts. And I'm not going to go through all of them in this video because we're going to be here for ages, but that core keyword is super important for getting the maximum efficiency out of this unit. Now, the other one that they have that is really important is Smokescreen, and this makes them a little bit more difficult to kill if they're not being targeted by a particular volume of firepower. If you have these guys in cover, which if you're taking only a unit of 5, it's not too hard, and you smokescreen them. A lot of times light anti-infantry shooting will not be able to kill them. Now, if anybody points a bigger gun at them, it is going to be able to punch through them relatively quickly, so they are certainly not survivable by any metric, but if you do need them to survive, the smokescreen gives them a little bit of an additional advantage in that situation. So with that in mind, let's talk about the attributes of this particular datasheet. Now, first off, there's sort of a mind-boggling variety of options you can take with these scouts. Between the weapons you equip with them, between the heavy weapons, camo cloak upgrades, special weapons in the unit, there's a lot you can do to personalize your scout squad. Before we get too far, I'm going to say that you can throw most of that out. Besides their primary weapon loadout, one of the benefits of scouts is that in the Space Marine chapter, outside of servitors, they are the cheapest points per model that you can get in the entire faction. And that's the biggest strength of scouts, is that unlike any other Marine, you're not paying that minimum 17, 18 points per model that you would. And that means that scouts give you a little bit of an option to fill out your army with additional model count in situations where that matters. They also have those incredible keywords and abilities. Obviously, being core infantry is important. Smokescreen is super useful, but oh boy, concealed position plus outflank gives you an enormous amount of flexibility in that pre-game phase, and that's super important. Now, obviously, there's some big trade-offs for all these advantages. First off, they have a ridiculous lack of resilience. Outside that smokescreen keyword, they fold like paper to everything, and if you're used to playing, 2 wound, 3 up armor-safe Space Marines, and even those die relatively quickly, playing scouts is gonna feel way worse. They just fall over immediately. They're also an elite slot, and this is probably the most damning thing for the scout squad, because that is the most contentious and most coveted position in a Space Marine army. Almost every competitive Space Marine option is in that elite slot. You're talking about competing with apothecaries. You're talking about competing with Vanguard veterans, with Blade Guard veterans, with Relic Contemptor dreadnoughts. All of these things that we talk about in Space Marines being so powerful are all in elites. So you have to ask yourself the question, am I really going to take one less unit of Vanguard veterans in order to include these scouts? 90% of the time, you're not. And that is one of the biggest downsides of this data sheet, is that battlefield role. That said, if you're playing a wide list that's bringing multiple detachments, you can sometimes fit room for these odd units in there. If you're bringing like a patrol plus a battalion or a Vanguard detachment, then you'll have 8 elite slots, and you have a little bit of flexibility in there if you need it. So it's not impossible that you have additional elite slots that are unused, but it is very rare. The other downside of being in elites rather than troops is that you also lose objective security, and that's a really big deal, especially on these units that want to either be a utility unit that sits on a backline objective or something like that, or forward deploys up the table and sits on a forward objective and fights your opponent over that. In both those situations, having objective security is crucial, and scouts just don't do it, so that's a big downside. Now, that's not to say you can't give them objective secured. They are core infantry, so Rights of War works on them just fine, but you don't really want to have to jump through an additional hoop to make your fragile infantry slightly better at fighting on objectives generally. They're already expensive enough without having to throw additional resources their way. Now, the one thing that scouts are relatively good at is that they are a pretty good applicator for damage buffs. In the context of the entire game of 40k, they're not particularly cheap, but in the context of Space Marines, they are, being, like we said before, the lowest points per model in the faction, and they punch and shoot pretty well. If you compare them to any other skirmishing style infantry, a unit like a Guard Squad or a Termagant or any of these like T3 chaff idiots, Scout Squads will absolutely tear through them, no problem. With the bolt pistol close combat weapon loadout, you're swinging 3 times in melee, you can shoot once with the gun, maybe throw a grenade, so you're attacking 4 or 5 times per model over the course of a turn, and that means that as a unit that wants to trade for those lighter units, they are one of the more efficient options that Space Marines have. While they certainly don't hold a candle in melee to something like a Vanguard veteran with the Lightning Claw, they are almost half the cost. And in a lot of situations, that's a really big deal. Now, moving on from there, we'll talk about a couple places where this sort of extra damage buff is important. And I think the number one place is anyone who can turn on those melee profiles for the scouts. Those specifically being White Scars, Space Wolves, and Blood Angels. Black Templars are another melee-specific chapter, but I don't think they synergize quite as well with the Scout Squad. But there's another reason that we're not going to talk about Black Templars in this section, because, well, we'll cover them later. Now, all of the chapters that I just mentioned have a particularly powerful buff in close combat, whether it's potentially +1 damage and additional threat range out of White Scars, +1 to hit and potential exploding 6s in Space Wolves, or +1 to wound and the potential for +1 attack in Blood Angels. This makes the scouts able to trade up with a lot of other armies' sort of low toughness melee units pretty effectively. So moving on to how to actually make use of scouts, that's going to be one of the most important things. The primary objective of scouts, I think, is to be a utility unit, and they are a pretty good utility unit. Now, for those who don't know, what I mean by a utility unit is one that isn't necessarily focused on dealing damage to your opponent's army, but is focused on supporting your army by scoring VPs and completing objectives. A utility unit can help you by screening, by contesting objectives out in front, by performing actions like deploy scramblers or raise the banners high. All of those are the purview of utility units, and most competitive 40k lists are going to need to include at least a couple of units of this type to ensure that they're able to complete those secondary objectives and score those victory points efficiently. Now, the combination of the outflank ability, which is one of the harder abilities to screen out, given that you can come in on any table edge, including your opponent's battlefield edge, which is something that you cannot do with a normal strategic reserve, means that if your opponent doesn't have excellent screening of their own, it's an easy unit that you can drop into your opponent's deployment zone to deploy scramblers, complete line breaker, get engaged in all fronts. Any of those secondaries are easily scoreable by the scout squad. In addition, concealed positions makes them good at fighting over objectives in the center, gives them a little bit of extra threat range if you're trying to deliver them to something early, and they can also potentially complete objectives like deploy scramblers or raise the banners high in that center area of the table where your slower infantry that deploys in your deployment zone has a tougher time getting to. Anybody who's played in cursors or infiltrators in a Space Marine army knows how powerful that concealed position is going to be, and scouts just do exactly that, but for almost 50% less cost than an incursor unit. Now, the other thing that scouts do, and the thing that I mentioned a couple times in this video, is that they trade decently well into lightly armored enemies, which can be a downside of Space Marines. Space Marines lose a lot in games where their opponent can use cheaper models to kill their units than they can do back. So if you trade up into a Space Marine army repeatedly, meaning that you're killing their powerful and expensive units with your cheap and inexpensive units, Space Marines often just run out of steam and aren't able to answer a gameplay style like that. Scouts, being the cheapest models in the Codex outside servitors, give you an out for that. They're able to fight units like Drukhari, Riches, or Incubi, or Sisters Repentia relatively efficiently, either by standing out on objectives up in the middle and forcing your opponent to charge them to kill them, which then lets you respond with your larger units and trade favorably, or actually just charging those units themselves if your opponent doesn't deal with them. Now, they're not perfect at this. They are a little bit too expensive, and without buffs, they only kill 5 or 6 of those Witch or Repentia equivalent units. They're actually almost defensively identical, which is funny. But between shooting, throwing a grenade, and charging them, I think they kill 5 and a little bit on average with a unit of 5 scouts. But if you're able to layer a couple buffs and some rerolls on them, they should be able to kill most of the unit by themselves, which is a pretty significant trade-up. Now, in order to leverage that low cost per model, what you can't do is spend points on upgrades for them. So special weapons, power weapons, heavy weapons, all of those I wouldn't put on scout squads. It's unfortunate because I think the sniper rifle scout squad looks really cool and is conceptually really cool, but unfortunately you're putting points into this unit who's not supposed to really be shooting at people very often. They want to get up, they want to mix it up with your opponent's light units, and if you put them out in the open to shoot somebody, even through those camo cloaks, if anybody's worried about that shooting, they're going to turn one set of heavy bolters or one Punisher cannon their way and just vaporize that unit right off the table, and you're down 100 points after you've spent all those points upgrading them. So generally, you just want to be taking as cheap a unit as possible and probably upgrading them with a bolt pistol and close combat weapon. That's definitely the best loadout if you have any buffs to apply to them in melee. So if you're one of the chapters that we talked about earlier, you definitely want that. If you're a chapter that's better at fighting at range, so something like Imperial Fists or Ultramarines, then I think there's an argument to deploy bolters or shotguns. And White Scars, I actually think may want to take shotguns sometimes just because they can advance and fire them without penalty, which is a pretty pretty nice buff to have. But 90% of the time, I think having that close combat weapon on them is going to be the way to go. I think the one potential foil to this may be Space Wolves, because they can take a special weapon in that squad. So you can just have one guy with a flamer or a melt-a-gun or something like that you can even use while you're advancing around the table. And I think that might be worth considering, but generally speaking, I would probably avoid upgrading scouts at all. Once you have the scouts in your list, putting them in situations where your opponent has to charge them and kill them, and thereby expose more expensive or more valuable units themselves, is a pretty big deal. Or putting them in your list for those situations where they can deploy scramblers or complete other secondary objectives is going to be the way to go. Now, the downside is that they don't fight over that center table or those center objectives as well as other concealed position deployers in the army do. So if you're trying to compare them to like an incursor squad, they pale in comparison. The upside is that they're significantly less expensive. They're 35 points less than an incursor squad. They're 50 points less than an infiltrator squad. And if all you care about is the raw bodies on the table and just putting those 3 attacks into somebody in melee, a scout squad is going to be better at doing that. If you care about the resilience at all, you probably want those Primaris bodies. But if that's not something you're worried about, then scouts are a pretty decent alternative. The big thing to keep in mind, though, however, is that a lot of times you will still have to take those incursors because scouts are, like we said before, an elite's choice and not a troop's choice. So if you're filling out a battalion, scouts don't do that for you. They just take up spots in the battalion, unfortunately. Now, before we move on to a final verdict, there's one other unit that I want to talk about in relation to this video that's sort of tangentially related to the scout squad, and that is the Black Templar Crusader Squad. Now, Crusader squads are another way to use the physical scout models, but it's also a unit that competes directly with scouts for the role that they're trying to fill in, which is those relatively cheap trading units that you can use to instigate trades or to attack your opponent's lightly armored units relatively efficiently. And the reason for that is that Crusader squads only cost 1 more point per model. They unfortunately lose outflank and lose the concealed position deployment, but they are troops, meaning they're obsec and they don't take up additional slots in your detachment, generally speaking. But they're also power armored, so for that 1 point, they also get +1 wound and +1 save, making them much harder to deal with, especially if you're fighting into units with only 1 damage weapons. Now, those are the basic initiates, and you have to have 4 initiates plus the unit leader in the squad to begin with, and you can fill out the squad with additional initiates and neophytes, which are just basically scouts that you add into the unit. Neophytes get a little bit of an additional benefit in that they can reroll their 1s if you have the same number of initiates and neophytes, which is pretty cool. In addition, neophytes have the smokescreen keyword just like scouts do, so they give the squad the ability to pop smokescreens if you need to. So sometimes I think including 1 neophyte in the unit is actually pretty cool, but generally speaking, keeping them to 5 Space Marines, either with both guns or chain swords, for just 15 points a model means they're strictly better than a tactical squad. And if you want to play an MSU style of Space Marines that brings a bunch of individual units, all of which can sort of trade up a little bit, Crusader squads are the best way to do that. So if you're not playing Black Templars, Scout squads can sort of fill that role of being able to trade, being able to bring a large quantity of bodies for relatively inexpensively. But if you are playing Black Templars, Crusader squads are here for you. Now, while that doesn't make them an exact competitor to scouts, since they certainly don't have the same flexibility of movement that scouts do, unfortunately, they are a better chaff unit than scouts are, for all the reasons we talked about before. Now, with all that out of the way, we can move on to a final verdict. And I think my opinion is going to be pretty obvious. Outside of the very few situations that I outlined earlier in this video, I don't think scouts are worth considering in your list. And even in those situations that we talked about, I think there are other options that you can take over scouts that are going to be more effective. For just 25 more points, you can take Assault Intercessors, which have the Primaris keyword, which have more attacks. They have a lot of benefits over scouts and their objective secured in the troop slot, and they don't have that concealed position deployment or outflanking. They aren't too much more expensive per model and get you a similar style of unit. Even if you want that concealed position, taking the Phobos troops like Incursors or Infiltrators are going to get you just an overall better profile that basically combines the damage output of both a melee and ranged focus scout all in one package, alongside that 3+ save, that higher wound count, and that Primaris keyword that's so important for things like transhuman physiology. And all of those things are troops that don't take up elite slots, which is another reason to take them over scouts. So unless you're specifically looking to add a lot of bodies to your army, I wouldn't really consider scouts. Now, that said, one of the reasons I wanted to make this video is that, A, I like scouts conceptually. I like having a lighter, more reconnaissance-focused unit available to Space Marines, but I also think that scouts are so close to the cusp of playability. I feel really sorry for all the people who have like 60 scouts because they want to play like the Scout Company list, where they have a bunch of scouts everywhere and it's led by Sergeant Tellian giving them +1 to hit and all that stuff, and you just can't do that anymore. You literally cannot legally take more than 30 scouts in a list outside of Black Templars. And that just sucks. So how are some ways that we could fix the scout unit, either by making it more playable or by making it more available to armies? Now, beyond the cost and the fragility of the unit, the thing that absolutely kills scouts, in my opinion, is that fight for elite slots. A lot of times, they're going to be outclassed by those Phobos infantry because they fulfill a similar role, and despite the fact that they're more expensive, they're troops, not elites, and that's such a huge deal. You open up additional slots for your veterans and your dreadnoughts while taking up troop slots, and while scouts are relatively inexpensive, the requirement to take additional troops to fill out a battalion on top of them kind of supersedes that low cost. Now, I think Games Workshop didn't want to put them in the troop slot because of the issue that we ran into in 8th edition, where as soon as you have this forward deploy cheap unit available to Space Marine players, and especially in 8th edition where having multiple detachments vastly benefited you by unlocking additional CP, you would just take as many of those as possible to unlock as many cheap battalions as you could. Which meant that a lot of the standard Space Marine infantry, even infiltrators and incursors who were all relatively playable, got outclassed by scouts just from the sheer fact that scouts were less expensive. Now, everything got bumped up in price in the 9th edition transition. Scouts are no stranger to that. They went up astronomically in that transition. They used to be 11 points per model, now they're 14. That's a lot. And while everything did go up, they went up a little bit more because they saw so much play. But then also adding them to the elite slot was a really big deal. Now, one piece of technology that I think Games Workshop has used in the past in 9th edition that they could bring back here is make them a troops choice similar to Poxwalkers in Death Guard. Poxwalkers and Chaos Cultists in a Death Guard detachment are subject to the Diseased Minions rule, which says that you cannot have more of them than you have bubonic Astartes units in any detachment out of the Death Guard Codex that you're bringing. Now, moving this over whole cloth from Death Guard to Space Marines and saying that you can't have more scouts than you have non-scout units wouldn't really help, because your characters and all of your other elite slot units would unlock spaces to bring scouts in. But what you could do is say that you cannot have more scout units in your army than you have Space Marine troops units. This means that in a detachment, if you wanted to bring the maximum number of scouts, you could bring 3 units of incursors, for example, and 3 units of scouts to fill out those 6 troop slots. And if you wanted additional scouts, you could just bring additional detachments to unlock those spaces. I think this fits the flavor of what Games Workshop was trying to go for, where scouts are not a particularly powerful unit, but definitely a good utility unit, and one that's trying to perform non-combat roles on the table, which is exactly what we want out of our troops options, but also makes it so that they aren't spammable like they were in 8th edition. I also think that just on their profile, they could be diversified a little bit more from the other concealed position deployers in the army. For example, their profile is basically the same as regular Phobos troops or regular Space Marines, despite the fact that they're just easier to kill. But having faster movement or special abilities could help a lot. Things like Omni Scramblers that Infiltrators have, which really separates them from Incursors, which are almost an identical unit. Something like that could help cement their position as a really important utility unit for the faction. You could also wrap the Scout keyword up with a lot of the Phobos keywords. Things like the Guerrilla Tactics stratagem could also target Scout units in addition to Phobos units, allowing them to strategic reserve themselves throughout the game, which I think is a perfect use for Scouts. It allows them to deploy back on the table and then pop up aggressively and be a unit that your opponent doesn't really want to deal with, but that can put themselves in annoying positions. I think perfectly fits what Scouts want to do, and I think it's a little silly that it's locked to just the Phobos keyword. In addition, I think if you made Scouts a little bit more accessible, locking Landspeeder Storm inclusion behind a paywall of bringing Scout units, so instead of unlocking them as dedicated transports for every other unit in the detachment, you just unlock them for Scout units that are in the detachment, makes a lot more sense. It's weird that you can bring dedicated transports for units that cannot go in them. That's very strange. But also the Landspeeder Storm is just one of the most phenomenal units in the Codex, especially the most phenomenal utility units, and adding a little bit of an additional paywall to that power, I think would be very nice to see, especially if you did some other stuff to make scouts a good include by themselves. Even if you didn't make it so that you wanted to put scouts inside the Landspeeder Storm, just having it so that scouts had to work alongside Landspeeder Storms would make the army a little bit more cohesive in general. It's been an interesting journey for the Scout Squad from 8th edition, when the unit was probably a little bit too powerful, up until now where it got dumpstered 6 ways from Sunday, but it's a unit that's right on the cusp of playability. Having a cheap unit with concealed position deployment with some utility abilities is so good. It just has one too many cons in its con column, I think, and it would be so easy for the designers to rework the unit into a much more playable state that also doesn't break the faction and give them access to monstrously cheap troop options that they shouldn't normally have. Hopefully we see this unit redone at some point in the future, but I do think there are 1 or 2 ways to use them in armies if you're trying to do so or answer specific things in the metagame. Anyway, that's all I had to say about that. Thanks everybody for watching all the way to the end of the video. Big thanks as well to my Patreon supporters over at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members and Twitch subscribers as well. All of those people help support the channel, and I really appreciate them. And I really appreciate you for watching all the way through. Thanks so much. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.